Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming back to this third installment of this lecture series. So far, I haven't managed to scare you all off. We will continue with the program I described during the last two meetings. So I've talked about the sources. We are still talking about the protagonists of the narrative I'm trying to construct. We have talked about the king, his administration, various Babylonian institutions, and last time I've started talking about aspects of Babylonian society. In particular, I have focused on those aspects of Babylonian society that demonstrably were affected by one way or another by Persian rule. So I will continue and conclude this part of my talk today. Perhaps even today, but certainly next week, we will try to contextualize what I've been talking about hitherto, and we will try to put all of this into a chronological scheme, and I will concentrate in particular on diachronic developments, which up to this point I haven't concentrated very much on at all. So, protagonists of Babylonian history under Persian rule, Babylonian society, in as much as Babylonian society is affected by Persian rule and Persian government. I have given you a very brief summary of how I conceptualize Babylonian society, at least the section of Babylonian society that is attested in the sources. So we are talking about an urban, fairly self-enclosed, somewhat clannish society, a society that can be considered to have been a house society if one wants to use the terminology that was developed by Claude Lévi-Strauss. Babylonian society is influenced by the state directly, foremost through the demands that were made upon society by the state, demands in the form of services requested and taxes extorted from the Babylonian population. Indirect influence of Persian rule can be seen in those aspects of the documentation that document interference of the state with the economy and some of the economic institutions, as well as with social institutions in a more general sense. First, I will talk about taxes. I have already begun to explain to you my view of the system of Babylonian taxation under Persian rule. We have to distinguish indirect taxes and direct demands for services and taxes that are made by the Persian government. Indirect taxes are imposts on various transactions, on sales, on the movement of goods, and on the use of water. This is the point at which I have stopped last time. So now we will talk about direct taxation. The most important point I want to make in this, at this juncture is to emphasize that taxation is basically a kind of sobriquet, a general term that I use both for labor services and military service, as well as for contributions in kind or in cash. So if I talk about taxation in this context here, you always have to keep in mind that both services in terms of military service or labor service and payments in cash and kind are intended. We have some evidence for the direct taxation, in a limited, narrow sense of the word, of institutional income, that is direct taxation of temple land and the agricultural income of the temples. A certain part of the harvest that was collected on temple estates had to be delivered to the crown. The the collecting center, the hub through which these texts were channeled, was the Marduk temple in Babylon, Esangila. So Esangila served as a collection point, as a center of redistribution of funds, mostly in kind, but also sometimes in cash, that were extracted by the royal administration from temple property. The collectors were in part royal officials and in part officials or people working in the realm of the Esangila temple. The fact that the temple served as a collection point for temple taxes of course explains the huge economic importance of the Esangila establishment, an economic importance that is unfortunately reflected in the sources only indirectly, because we don't have an archive from the Esangila temple. So we have to rely on information from other sources when we want to reconstruct the functioning of this system. However, those sources that we have are sufficiently explicit to allow us to reconstruct the functioning of this kind of direct taxation during the time of the Theisbids and in the first 2 decades of Darius. After Darius 22, if I remember correctly, we don't have any further attestations of this kind of taxation. This may simply be an accident of preservation of our sources. I don't see a good reason why this type of taxation should have been abolished. However, the fact remains that we can document this direct taxation of temple income only up to the end of the 6th century. It is a tax, this should be emphasized, that originates in the Neo-Babylonian period. So it was already extant under the Neo-Babylonian kings. During the reign of Nebuchadnezzar and Nabonidus, from which we have most information, the actual amount that was extracted from temple income fluctuated, and there was a certain amount of ad hoc organization of this kind of taxation. Apparently, under Cyrus and Cambyses, we have indications that in general 3 1/3% of temple income were collected by the state in this manner. However, I can't prove that this tax rate was still in effect under Darius. I want to emphasize at this point also that this is the only aspect of Babylonian economy and society where we can find a general tax on agricultural income. There is no such general tax on agricultural income with regard to agricultural income that was produced by private landowners, for instance. The way private landowners were forced to contribute to the interests of the state will be explained now. The locus classicus, as it were, to which one traditionally turns when talking about taxation and labor service in the Achaemenid Empire in Babylonia under the Achaemenid Empire, is of course the Murashu archive of the 5th century. I have set out the basic elements of the system on the slide you see here. We see a system of landholding that was organized around so-called bow properties or bow fiefs, bit kashti in Babylonian. These were estates that were allotted normally to collectives, so to groups of people who shared a common ethnic or professional background, and who in return had to furnish the state their military or labor service, and they also had to make payments of different kind at various junctures during the agricultural year. So the bit kashti, the bow property, is the nucleus of this system. There are different kinds of holdings that are also attested in the sources. Next to the beat Kashti, there is the chariot property and the horse property, the beat Nakapti and the beat Sise. It is clear from the terminology that the whole system was conceptualized as a system that was intended to furnish manpower and funds for the army. So the Bikashti would be the allotment of a normal soldier, archer in literally, whereas the chariot property would be the estate of someone who was expected to pay for or even to man a war chariot, and the BCC would be the holding of a man serving in the cavalry. The view that we get from the Murashu archive is emphatically put into perspective by earlier sources. I will, in the following, talk mostly about the Bossippian archives of the 6th century, since these are the most important source of information that can be brought to bear on this issue. However, also data from Sippar or from Babylon could be used to serve as a contrast to the image drawn on the basis of the Murashu archive. However, I will concentrate on Bossippa because we have so much information that can be linked together, and that is also fairly new. To a large part, the sources I draw on here are still unpublished. Looking at the Bossippa archives of the 6th century, most of the sources I talk about date to the reign of Darius, so very end of the 6th century. But we also have some earlier texts, of course. Looking at the Bossippa archives, one notes that the whole system, of course, is not an Achaemenid Persian innovation. To a large extent, the structures, also the structures we see in the Murashu archive, were extant in one form or another also in the Neo-Babylonian period. In fact, it can be demonstrated that some elements hail back to the Assyrian period, and I don't even want to go into the issue of structural continuity that links this system to earlier systems of labor extraction that we can find attested, for instance, in the first half of the 2nd millennium BC in Babylonia. So in any case, the bow properties that are so prominent in the Murashu sources, are not a Persian innovation. They already exist under the Neo-Babylonian kings. We also see that the rural beat Kashti, the rural bow property that is predominant in the Murashu sources, is not the only possible base of taxation. It's not even the most frequent one. Overall, the conclusion must be that the Murashu system reflects the particular circumstances of Nippur, which is largely an agricultural backwater. No one ever goes to Nippur if he or she can avoid it in the 6th and 5th century. So it is a particular situation and to some extent atypical. The Bossippa evidence is much more useful, I think, for reconstructing the taxation system as it affected the larger part of the Babylonian urban society in the 6th and 5th century than the Murashu archive with its particular agricultural setting in a rather small city, Nippur, and with its strong reliance on non-Babylonians. The basic principles of taxation as it affected urban Babylonians are set out on this slide here. Taxation, always taxation and service requirements can be based on land holdings. In part, they are based on land holdings that go back to 7th century land allotments made by the king to the benefit of Babylonian city dwellers. Taxation can be based on urban property, so on urban residents, on neighborhoods. And taxation can also be based on a shared professional background. In very many cases, it will we can assume that those three taxation bases, as it were, actually fall together in that land allotments were frequently made to people that shared a certain agricultural background, and these people also tended to live next to each other. What we frequently call tax obligations in our studies and translations of Babylonian texts are in the predominant number of cases actually service obligations. Basically, if one wanted to generalize, one could say that the vast majority of payments that are made in this context by individuals are payments that are intended at one level or another to pay for the hiring of substitute laborers or substitute soldiers. So taxation is taxation in the narrow sense of the word, in the sense of extraction of payments, is actually only part of the system, and it's the smaller part. The major part of the system is the recruitment of labor and of soldiers. The state was mostly interested in manpower, and only on a secondary plane, on a secondary level, the state was interested in contributions in cash and in kind. So I will now talk in somewhat more detail about the basis for taxation without discussing for very long some of the details I set out on this slide. However, rural property as a basis for taxation in the 6th century under Persian rule has very frequently roots in the Neo-Babylonian period. So it has roots in land allotments that were made by Neo-Babylonian kings at the end of the 7th century or in the first half of the 6th century. These land allotments are were usually linked to investments of the kings in the agricultural hinterland of the cities, in canal building undertakings and other large-scale work schemes that were intended to open up the hinterland of the cities for agricultural development. In the wake of these royal investments, land was allotted to to urban inhabitants of the cities in whose hinterland these undertakings were going on. These land allotments were structured in a regular manner, and they were, for this reason, called Hanshu, which means 50 structures. So these are land allotments that consist of regular field systems of a predetermined size. However, the size of these 50 structures varies from city to city, apparently. In any case, it seems that the basic structure was the same, however, in Babylon, in Borsippa, and in Uruk. These are the three cities where we have most information. So these land allotments usually benefited urban families, very often of priestly background. In Borsippa, these priestly families who held land in these 50 structures were grouped together in groups of subunits of 10 households, or 10 households, or also 10 fields. 10 fields correspond to 10 households. These units were then called Esherto, which means a group of 10, or, and this is a particularity of Borsippa, they were called Zikpu, which means ensign, so a kind of military emblem that represented this group of landholders and presumably also soldiers, potentially. The taxes or the service required for in return for holding land in such 50 structures was called boat tax, or it was called urashu, corvée labor. The official responsible for the extracting of this service was the gugalu, the royal official responsible for the management of the agricultural infrastructure. This system exists already under Nebuchadnezzar, and it keeps its basic structure well into the reign of Darius I. Whenever we rarely hear of Bow properties, of the beat kashti, these Bow properties that are so important in the Murashu archive, in these sources. Sometimes it is quite clear that when the sources do talk about beat kashti, they just mean the old Khanshu structures. So the newer Persian terminology is sort of grafted onto the existing Khanshu system. Urban property can serve as a basis for taxation as well. We hear of levies of the city ward, so the city quarter, the diku shababti. Again, the unit that is used for extracting labor service is a unit of 10 men or 10 households. Typically, one group of 10 people has to pay for one laborer or one soldier. Sometimes we also hear about professional groups, usually priests, who have to do collective labor service together, or who together have to pay for collective labor service. The taxation of this kind is usually managed by the temple. So the temple calls up its priests for labor service as a collective in response to demands made upon it by the royal administration. The terminology for these various types of labor need not detain us for very long. We find remnants of the old Babylonian tradition of labor service, in that the word ilku, which is a very general term for tax or service obligation, is used. It's a kind of blanket term that may subsume all of the terms that I will mention in the following. We find the bow tax, or the bow tax or the bow service, the service as an archer or as a common soldier. The actual payment that is made for in the context of paying the bow tax is frequently designated as a payment for, or rather to, a royal soldier, a tzab shari. So that the payment to the tzab shari is basically identical with the bow tax, only looked at from another side, from another perspective. A royal soldier is the substitute, the substitute who is supposed to do actual service in lieu of the landholder, who in theory would be required to serve, but has of course no wish to go to Elam to dig a canal. So these people, these priests in Borsippa, pay for a sort of personal royal soldier, a personal tzab shari, who then will serve in their stead. And as I said, the payment of this bow tax very frequently takes this form of payment to a tzab shari, and depending on the perspective of the text, either the silver of the tzab shari is talked about, or the payment of silver for kashtu. It is important to note that payment of the bow tax does not imply ownership or control over a beat kashti, bow property. These bow properties, as I said, are comparatively rare in Borsippa. The bow tax is used interchangeably with a term for a kove tax or kove service, urashu. This is actually an Assyrian loanword which goes back to terminology used in Nuzi, so in northern Mesopotamia in the second half of the second millennium. It's a term that was introduced into Babylonian usage by the Assyrians. This kove service is also organized along the same lines as the kashtu service, which is basically the same thing. So we are talking about tax units of 10 people. payments are made in silver that is usually intended for the hiring of substitutes. Service can be rendered either in Babylonia, in the hinterland of the cities, or in various faraway locations, especially in Elam during the period of the concentrated building work undertaken in Jursa by Darius. Sometimes we hear of service in northern Babylonia, in Opis, for instance. This is military service. Some people are sent to the sealand, or occasionally we also hear of places I at least have never heard of before, such as this Karabal or Karamal. I don't know where that is. Urasho service, corvée service, can also include service on royal estates. We have 3 or 4 indications for this. Overall, a labor service on royal estates is, however, something that is attested very sparsely in our sources, and one has to assume that royal estates that, of course, did exist in this period were usually worked by and cultivated by royal personnel. Here I quote one unpublished example of a text, in this case a text that probably comes from Sippar, that shows you the kind of transaction we encounter in the sources. This one is particular for various reasons. I will briefly read out the translation. All the names which I abbreviate here by A, B, and C are Babylonians. So A has received from B and C the ilku payment, so the payment for labor or military service that is intended for the royal soldiers, so that is for the substitute soldiers of so-and-so. Substitute soldiers that have to do bow service or pertaining to the archers literally, who are recruited from among or perhaps furnished by the alphabet scribes of, and then a name that is lost, for the period until the end of the 12th month of the 28th of Darius. This was paid then by B and C. So you see this sort of the chain of various taxation relevant terms. We have the royal soldier, named here, so these are the people who actually do the service as substitutes for those who in theory would have been required to do service. The actual payment is called a kashtu, so a payment for bow service or archer service, and the collective of people required to do, in theory, required to do the service, who, however, pay substitutes. In this case, are Aramaic scribes or alphabet scribes who belong to the household of an official, presumably, whose name is lost. Alphabet scribes are usually found in a retinue of Persian officials rather than Babylonian officials. The interesting thing here is that the text is dated to the 5th year of Xerxes, and the payment is actually for labor service or military service that was required to have been done 13 years earlier. So you see that this that the Persian administration has sort of a long memory, and we can only guess what the actual backgrounds of the transaction here were and why this payment was paid with such delay. Unfortunately, this text cannot be contextualized within a known archive. It so far is isolated. Its museum context suggests that it comes from Sippar. However, there are very few texts from Sippar that postdate the 2nd year of Xerxes, so it's something of a riddle that I present to you here. Other taxes in Borsippa, so actual taxes in this case rather than service obligations. I've already talked about indirect taxes last week. We find taxes that consist in food and in the delivery of foods. Actually, here again we have also in part a service obligation. Some texts talk about the upiatu. This is a loan word. So that is food intended for the king or for the royal table. These upiatu in Bossipa are typically sent to Susa, and we have attestations for these from the second half of Darius's reign. There is also a curious type of obligation occasionally mentioned in Bossipa, that is the obligation to provide on a sort of personalized level for Carian or Egypto-Carian mercenaries who are billeted in the houses of Babylonian priests. So these poor priests were told by the administration that they were required to take in families of Egypto-Carian mercenaries, and they also had to pay for the living cost of these families. In many cases, the recipients of these payments are women, so the women of these soldiers who are absent. So the men are not in Bossipa; they do service. We do not know where. Their families remain in Bossipa and have to be taken care of by the Bossipian priesthood. We also find a tax that is called flour tax. In part, this requires the furnishing of flour, so it is in that sense a real tax in kind. It also implies the obligation to grind flour that sometimes is furnished by the authorities to people who have this flour tax obligation. So again, the aspect of the service obligation is predominant, at least in part, of the sources. We do also find money payments, so payments of silver in cash. Usually these money payments are being made in Susa, or in any case not in Bossipa. In part, these may be taxes in the narrow sense of the word. However, I would prefer to consider these payments rather as cash contributions, perhaps even sort of ad hoc cash contributions for building costs and the like. Some of these payments are made on building sites in the countryside in Ilam, at Nar Kabari, for instance. Contributions to building costs and the likes, and sometimes these are clearly also gifts, or if you wish, bribes, or maybe the same thing, intended for Persian officials. In this case, money payments are often accompanied also by various outlays that are incurred by these Babylonian priests for foodstuffs which may be intended for feasts or the like. So one gets the impression that the Babylonians who incur these payments have to go to Susa at certain occasions, and at Susa they have to entertain important Persians. That seems to be the general background of these texts. I give you here one example that is as yet unpublished. The names in red are Persians. So these we mostly are talking about silver lists. In this case, the payments are very small. Sometimes also important sums are mentioned in this corpus. But this is somewhat more typical. So we see a list of silver, which in this case is at the disposal of a certain Babylonian who is an emissary of the archive-holding Babylonian, so of the Babylonian from whose archive this text originates. The silver that is accounted for here is dispensed in various ways, which are explained in the list. So we see a payment for a sheep, which was given to a Persian in the first month. Usually these transactions take place in the first month. We see a payment for wine. We see a payment for another sheep, which goes to the Aramaic scribe of another Persian. And then the Persian that is mentioned first, this Artuku, he gets another sheep, and so on and so forth. So payments of silver, payments for sheep, payments for wine, payments for shoes occasionally, payments for spices, are all listed in these texts together, which prompts me to assume that these are not straightforward tax lists, but rather texts which have to do with a not entirely regulated and standardized procedure, which has to do with these Babylonians who go to Susa and have to acquire the goodwill in one way or another of the Persian administration. If we want to quantify the tax load on Babylonian households, we encounter the problem, of course, that the sources do not lend themselves very easily to generalization. However, as a sort of approximation, I would assume that a tax load of 36 shekels of silver and sometimes up to 1 mina of silver per annum per household would be fairly common for upper class households. To put this into perspective, 1 mina of silver is the cost of a slave. And it is also, well, perhaps the income of the yearly income of 2 manual laborers, 2 well-paid manual laborers. So these are substantial amounts we are talking about here. It is quite clear that this kind of tax load could only be extracted from fairly well-to-do households, as those priests, of course, could benefit from. Implications of what I have said, we have continuity from the Neo-Babylonian period. We see the adaptation of extant forms of taxation and of labor mobilization that directly draw on the Neo-Babylonian precedent. I have talked about the various bases of taxation that are also set out again on this slide. So urban real estate, rural possessions, and professional background. We do see a gradual extension and to some degree a systematization of the system under Darius. However, systematization is a term that needs to be taken with a grain of salt. Overall, the complexity and the variation within the taxation system was considerable, and it's not it would not be a good idea to overgeneralize the evidence on the basis of the evidence that we have. On the outset of my talk, I told you that I would base myself fairly rigorously on the Babylonian evidence. However, talking about taxation, we at least have to mention briefly Herodotus, who famously talks about taxation under Darius, claiming that Darius had reorganized and systematized tax collection in the Persian Empire. The contribution extracted from the province of Babylonia, according to Herodotus, consisted in 1,000 of talents of silver that was to a large extent hoarded by the great king, and in 5 eunuch boys. To cut a long story short, contemporary Babylonian sources do not confirm this at all. And I personally would be inclined to not to lay too much weight on this evidence. I want to emphasize again that the main interest of the state lies in the extraction of manpower for labor and for military service. Only as a secondary purpose, taxation aims at the extraction of cash or taxes in kind that are intended to finance state labor and the royal court. The emphasis of the system is clearly on manpower. Under Darius, we have quantitative change, but certainly not fundamental qualitative change with respect to earlier periods. silver payments made by taxpayers on the local level are usually intended for paying for substitute labor. This is a corollary of the first point I've set out on this slide. The extraction of manpower is the main purpose, the main raison d'etre of this system. We have very little evidence for systematic payment of cash taxes, but rather what cash payments we see that are made in Persia are perhaps better interpreted as ad hoc payments and as gifts. Certainly, we have a decentralized system that is far less uniform than some general statements on the topic have assumed. What are the implications of all of this? Some of the implications are sort of relevant for economic history, and I won't go into them at this point in any detail. Suffice it to state, or rather to claim in this brief form, that this form of taxation regime furthers the process of monetization in the Babylonian economy that is anyway ongoing because of other reasons. There is no indication that the Achaemenid government engaged in large-scale thesaurration of silver. In any case, the price development about which we are well informed during the reign of Darius seems to exclude that there was a substantial withdrawal of silver from circulation within Babylonia. Prices rise rather than fall. One question which I will not answer now, but which will be discussed in the final installment of this lecture series, is the question whether or not the tax load that was imposed on upper class Babylonians under Darius contributed to the economic difficulties and the unrest after the death of Darius. I, at this point, just want to pose the question. And with this, we move on to aspects of Babylonian socioeconomic development that are indirectly influenced by the presence of the Persian government and by the fact that Babylonia was part of the Persian Empire. Here I have to be fairly selective. There are various phenomena that could be discussed under this heading. I will limit myself to just a few, and in part I will also just refer to things I have already said. Obviously, the first point one needs to mention are the implications both on a practical level and on the ideological plane of the fact that there is no Babylonian king anymore, but rather the great king, the Persian king. This is something which, of course, is mostly a concern of the elites. The sort of a common Babylonian probably did not notice a great difference for a commoner. Government was simply oppressive, and the difference between the Persians and the Babylonians, at least during the first decades of Persian rule, was presumably negligible. I have explained to you this concept of the absent king, so the remote presence of the great king in the background of the minds of officials that doesn't correspond to an actual physical or practical presence of the great king in the lives of these officials. This has as a corollary that the Persian governor in Babylon fulfills basically the administrative function of the king, of the Babylonian king that at this time no longer exists. On the ideological level, there were attempts to integrate the fact of Persian rule in the Babylonian worldview, which in this period has a very strong focus on the centrality of the city of Babylon. So it's a political and religious worldview in whose center the city of Babylon and its religious institutions have to be are situated and have to be given a great deal of attention by an ideal ruler. As I said, there are some attempts to integrate Persian rule in this system. The Cyrus cylinder, to some extent, is an example. We also know that there was a cult of the royal image in Babylonian temples, similar to the veneration of royal statues in earlier periods. So here we have examples for the integration of the great king in the Babylonian system, as it were. On the other hand, we do hear about rebellions, of course, you all know this, and these rebellions explicitly draw on earlier traditions. The kings call themselves Nebuchadnezzar, and one of them claims to be a son of Nabonidus, so it's a direct reference to earlier traditions which clearly have survived in the minds of the Babylonian elites. Persian government interferes with Babylonian society, especially with the upper ranks of society, in various manners. We find good evidence for family networks that prosper under royal patronage. There doesn't seem to be any fundamental difference here with respect to earlier periods of Babylonian history. We have talked briefly about these family networks already in one of the previous talks. I told you that the family networks of priestly families disappear after Darius, and other families with another type of background then step in and profit from the patronage of the Persian administration, perhaps even the patronage of the Persian king. So change in officials does occur clearly, and there is no difference here to earlier periods. The change in offices, so the abolishment of individual offices rather than just a change of office holder. Such changes do occur, but they are comparatively rare, and they are usually connected with crisis of one sort or another. We can demonstrate this best for the years after the death of Cambyses and for the unrest in the first years of Xerxes. This is something I will talk about next week. A special case is that of Babylon and the temple of Esangila. The details again will come next week. Here at this point I just want to say that Babylon maintains its centrality as within the province of Babylon as a center of political power, and certainly also as an economic center, as the hub of economic exchange in the province. However, Babylonians, in the sense of families from Babylon, after 484 do not dominate any longer in other cities as they used to do before 84. We know that, for instance, in Uruk, but also in other cities such as Sippar or Tigritain or Dilbat, there were communities of Babylonians, in the sense of families from Babylon, that kept themselves to some degree separated from the local families of Dilbatians or Urukians, and that had an important role in the administration of the temples and of the cities. These, in Uruk, we can demonstrate explicitly that these families of Babylonian origin are no longer in the city and no longer have an important role in the 5th century, whereas in the 6th century they have dominated the administration of the temples and of the city. So this is clearly something which reflects social and political change, and we will discuss this in detail next week. Interference with law, of course, I've already mentioned the evidence for data. So procedural rules and tariffs of various sort that are imposed by the Persian government. By and large, however, there seems to be no structural change in Babylonian law in this period. Basically, we have linear development or even no perceptible change at all in the documents. However, we do see an evolution of document formats. This is again this aspect of diplomatics, about which I have talked briefly in the first lecture. This change is at first fairly limited and slow, and from the reign of Artaxerxes onwards, change happens at a somewhat accelerated rate. So the document formats change more rapidly and more fundamentally than was the case in the first part of Persian rule. At this point, I will just formulate the hypothesis that this has to do with new scribal schools or scriptoria, if you wish, that come to the fore in this period and whose predominance leads to a weakening of the tradition of that is associated with what I call the long 6th century. So to some degree, also this is a phenomenon that belongs into the wider category of changes that occur in Babylonia after 484. And also this will be discussed next week. Direct interference of the Persians with the economy can be seen in an attempt to regulate interest rates. This is something which also the Neo-Babylonian kings tried to do and to some extent maybe even achieved. The Persians continue. However, rates tend to be higher than in earlier periods. In the Neo-Babylonian period and in the rest of the 6th century, interest was usually 20%. In the 5th century and thereafter, interest rates fluctuate around 40%, and in most cases they are more or less 40%. The question one has to pose is whether this reflects a change in custom, whether it's Persian custom, or whether we have here interest rates that are to some degree determined by economic circumstances. I cannot answer this question. I would assume that it's more probable that we have to do here with custom or in any case with interest rates that have been imposed to some degree. We find these high interest rates also in Egypt in the Aramaic papyri. We should note in parentheses that the interest rate of Susa, so the Susa rate, is once cited as normative in a text that comes from in the 5th century. This gives a good indication for the degree of economic integration, as it were, of southwestern Iran with southern Babylonia. The city of was a small provincial town at this time, certainly not a major center, and it is thus not surprising that the inhabitants of took their economic cue, as it were, from the Persian capital that was, after all, not so very far away, even though it was not technically part of Babylonia. The Persian administration tries to control silver qualities. In part, we find here a continuation from the earlier period of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. We find, however, also Persian innovations. I will just talk about one of them, the so-called silver qualification, which literally means silver that is income of the royal cash box, erbusha arani. This is, I repeat, it's a silver qualification. It is an indication of a certain type of silver. It has no implication as to the type of transaction. It doesn't mean that silver, it is not said that silver that is designated as erbusha arani was intended in one way or another as a payment for the king. No, it's just an indication of quality. an example of silver as it is found in Iran in this period. The Erbusha Errani is important because it gives us some indication as to the institutional background of the control of silver qualities. I cite just one text that is particularly informative. A payment of a small amount of silver is discussed in a small note. It is a payment that in the end benefits the Esida temple. This payment is effected at the cash box on orders of a certain person. And it is made in the presence of a goldsmith and a smith. These people are responsible for the cash box. So these are people who have the technical qualifications for the control of silver. A goldsmith and a smith. We thus see that this cash box institution, the Arano, was an institution where silver was presumably melted down, or in any case submitted to an examination that established its degree of purity. And this was apparently a royal institution. The question we have to ask is in which way the characteristic of silver being Erbusha Errani was actually expressed, whether the silver was stamped or whether it was put in a sealed leather bag or whether it was in fact coinage. We cannot, technically, I think we cannot exclude any of these possibilities. Babylonian terminology, of course, is traditional, and even in the Hellenistic period when coinage was clearly around, silver continued to be weighed. So I would not exclude, but of course I cannot prove, that also in Achaemenid period texts, occasionally at least, our texts talk about coinage without explicitly saying so. And if that is the case, silver that is Erbusha Errani might very well be such coinage. However, I cannot prove it, and other explanations are also possible. Now, final point, if I may detain you for another 5 minutes, then I will manage to conclude this part of my lecture as I plan to. Indirect influence of the fact that Babylonia was part of the Persian Empire can be seen in those sources that talk about the movement of the physical movement of Babylonians eastward. So in the opening up of Iran for the travel of Babylonians. Overall, however, we see in this respect again the fact that I have already mentioned earlier, the fact that Babylonians by and large lived in a fairly self-enclosed and not very open society. In short, Babylonians did not like to travel very much, and the evidence for Babylonians moving in Iran, or in any case explicitly and definitively outside the geographical boundaries of Babylonia, is quite slim. We find evidence for the trip of, this has been well studied, a certain Itimaduk Balatu, an important businessman and entrepreneur. Under the Teispitz, he travels to Iran. This seems to be a kind of goodwill trip that has to do with Itimaduk Balatu's business contacts with the royal administration. So he goes to Iran to meet his new employers in one way or another. It's not a strictly economic journey. Babylonian priests, provincial officials, notables of different kinds, and judges fairly regularly go to Susa. This has to do with their need to present themselves, perhaps to the great king, in any case to high royal officials at various junctures of the year. Gauthier Toligny has recently studied the evidence in great detail, and there is also an important article by Caroline Wasechers on this topic, to which I simply can refer. We hear of Babylonian forced laborers both in southern Babylonia and southwestern Iran. Sometimes such forced laborers got as far as Persepolis. However, there seem to be very few or next to no high-ranking Babylonians that demonstrably came as far as Persepolis. Overall, there is very little evidence for Babylonians engaged in long-distance trade. Long-distance trade was in the hands of non-Babylonians. I give you here just one example where we do see Babylonians trading with Iran. All the evidence that we have, just 3 or 4 tablets, come from northern Babylonia, from Sippar. Sippar is very close to the point where the route to the Iranian highland begins, so there is a kind of geographical proximity which may have prompted Sipparians to engage in this kind of trade, which otherwise was not something Babylonian entrepreneurs had great interest in. So here we see evidence for the trade in skins of sheep and goats that takes place in Ekbatana at the end of the reign of Darius. Some of the itineraries we can document. So this would be the trip of the Babylonians, notables and so forth, to Susa. They go first south and then through the sea land to Susa. The route of Itimaduk Balato and perhaps also of Ishar Taribi, the man who is the principal protagonist of this text, to Ekbatana will have led him first northwards and then via there on this tortuous route towards Ekbatana. Here is one indication for the anxieties of travel. This is a letter written by Itimaduk Balato here with a short form of his name. While he was in Iran, he is very concerned that he did not get any letters from home, and takes great pains to make clear that he himself is well. So he repeats over and over that he wants to get information, and he also wants to make sure that his family at home is not idle, but that especially his son Shirkuh, who in his turn will later on travel a lot in Iran, should not be idle, but should do what is required. So he's a bit anxious. Well, if Babylonians don't travel, in general, who does? I've mentioned this already. Merchants, especially royal merchants, are very frequently West Semites. And what evidence we have, apart from the few indications I have just discussed for travel also in Iran, concerns West Semites. Sometimes also Iranians, of course, who are mentioned in Babylonian sources. But frequently we have these West Semites travel towards the west. So in Ibernari, so Syria and the Levant, is nearly exclusively documented for West Semitic merchants, so people of Aramean or Judean extraction. Babylonians don't do this kind of business normally, or very rarely. People who travel in the business of the royal administration, sometimes they can be Babylonians, of course, but more often they are Egyptians or Iranians, very rarely West Semites. Again, this is an indication for what I consider the kind of closed character of Babylonian society. And at this point, I will just mention what we will be talking about next week. So about interactions, continuities, and ruptures. I will try to create a stronger diachronic perspective on what I have talked about hitherto. And at this point, I thank you.